I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 93 of EO Radio Show. Today I'm going to talk about the procedures for changing the classification of an organization described in Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3, changing it from a private foundation to one of the many different types of public charities, or the other direction, from public charity status back to private foundation status. This classification is often referred to as the private foundation classification, since the title of the relevant section in the tax code is Private Foundation Defined. But it is also the section that points to many other provisions that define public charity status, which sets the rules for meeting the public charity classification that is so important to charitable contribution deduction limitations and various excise taxes that penalize certain types of activities. From time to time, charitable organizations described in Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3 need or want to change the classification, either because they have attained sufficient public support to be classified as publicly supported, and they don't want to be classified as a private foundation any longer, or governance document changes cause a change in the supporting organization classification, or in many cases, they were simply misclassified from the outset. So today's talk is about the procedures to make these changes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. So before we talk in detail about the procedures for changing an organization's classification, let's focus a little bit on the actual language of Internal Revenue Code Section 509. That's the provision that identifies the private foundation definition. For listeners who want more detail about the types of public charity and private foundation classifications, check out our earlier episodes. Episode 5 on navigating the complex rules that describe a public charity, episodes 23, 24, and 61 that discuss supporting organization classification, and episode 18, which addresses private operating foundation status. We're not going to talk in detail about what these different classifications are today. So let's start, though, with a basic overview of Section 509. 509 starts with the general rule, which is a rule of exclusion. Note the rule is far more complicated than my summary here will be, but for conversational purposes, it's important to summarize these options, since it may be to an organization's benefit to be classified differently than its original classification. And that's the point of our episode today, is to talk through how to make that change. But first, let's talk about the term private foundation and what that means. So under 509, for purposes of the federal tax law, the term private foundation means a domestic or foreign organization described in Code Section 501c3 other than several different categories. And I'm going to go through those 4 categories now. So it's any organization that doesn't meet one of the following tests. Number 1, an organization described in Section 170B1A of the Internal Revenue Code, other than certain subclauses of that section. And this classification includes charities that are categorically not private foundations, regardless of the amount or source of contributions. That is, churches, schools, hospitals, governmental units, and those organizations that normally receive at least 1/3 of their support from the public. The second type are organizations which normally receive more than 1/3 of their support from gross receipts and public support. That is, generally organizations like museums and entities that support themselves from earned revenue from their exempt function. These types of organizations can't receive more than 1/3 of their support from each taxable year from the sum of their gross investment income and their unrelated business taxable income. So that's the second category of public charity that is excluded from the definition of private foundation. The third class identified in 509 of the Internal Revenue Code is a huge class of supporting organizations. Those are organizations which are organized and at all times operated exclusively for the benefit of, or to perform the function of, or to carry out the purposes of, one or more specified organizations that are described in paragraph 1 or 2, that is, the publicly supported organizations that I just described, churches, educational organizations, organizations that receive more than 1/3 of their support from the public. So a supporting organization is organized to support one of those types of entities and is operated, supervised, or controlled by one of those organizations, or supervised or controlled in connection with one or more of the organizations, or operated in connection with one or more of those publicly supported organizations, and is not controlled directly or indirectly by disqualified persons. So the supporting organization tests are very complicated, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 episodes devoted just to the supporting org classification. So the 4th excluded classification from the definition of private foundation are organizations that are organized and operated exclusively for testing for public safety. So with that overview of the 4 types of organizations that are not private foundations, let's now turn to the procedure for requesting that the IRS change the classification on its records. This is an important step for organizations that want the IRS website to reflect the appropriate classification and also to generate a correct IRS determination letter that the organization can provide to donors and grantors, foundations that are interested in supporting the organization. This request is made with the all-purpose IRS Form 8940. Here's a rundown of the mechanics of the process. First, it's important to realize that organizations must electronically file Form 8940, and the fill-in form is used to request a number of miscellaneous determinations under many different sections of the Internal Revenue Code. So it's a confusing form to use since you'll need to know which code section applies to the request. And for the private foundation and public charity status classifications, you need to know which of the statuses you are converting from and which status you are converting to. So back to the mechanics. To submit Form 8940, first of all, the user must request an account on pay.gov. And then once you have the account set up, you enter 8940 in the search box, select the form, and then complete it. Now, it's important to note that there is a user fee for this request. The user fee has to be paid at the time of each request, and you have to pay it through pay.gov when you file the Form 8940. These can be made directly from a bank account or by credit or debit card. You can't submit the Form 8940 without the correct user fee. The user fee amounts vary from time to time. It's updated annually. And for the current Form 8940 user fee, check out the show notes, and we'll have a link there to the user fee section of the website. You can also call the IRS. The phone number and the other details are in the show notes. So back to 8940 and the mechanics. All organizations complete parts 1 through 4 of the 8940, including any applicable schedules. The Form 8940 usually, for most of these requests, has some required attachments, and you'll have to submit a separate request, a separate 8940, if you want to ask for more than one type of miscellaneous request under 8940. So back to the attachments. A complete request usually requires one or more documents in addition to the fill-in form. However, pay.gov accommodates only one uploaded file. So before submitting the Form 8940, it's important to consolidate all of your attachments into a single PDF file. The attachments that are combined should be attached in the following order, omitting any that don't apply to your request. Start with your organizing document, that is your articles of incorporation or your trust instrument, whatever the case may be. Any amendments to that organizing document in chronological order, the bylaws or other operating rules for the organization. If you're represented by an attorney or a tax accountant, you'll need to attach Form 2848. And then typically one of the schedules from the Form 990, typically Schedule A is required for an organization converting to public charity status. The IRS also suggests that you include the organization name and EIN on each page of the supplemental response and identify the part and line number to which the information relates. Now, interestingly, the Form 8940 requires the signature of an officer, director, trustee, or other official who's authorized to sign for the organization submitting the request. This signature can be digitally attached at the end of Part 4. The signature must be accompanied by the title or authority of the signer and the date. So those are the mechanical parts. The complicated part of 8940 is in Part 2. It's in that section that the user identifies which miscellaneous request is being made. These are the options on the fill-in form, and the first 5 are irrelevant to the public charity and private foundation classification requests. these other categories that this miscellaneous form is used for are advance approval of set-asides for private foundations, advance approval of voter registration activities by a public charity that wants to be described in Code Section 4945F, advance approval of individual grant-making procedures. This is typically requested by private foundations, and also exceptions from the Form 990 filing requirements that apply typically to churches and religious organizations. And finally, another miscellaneous request that's covered by 8940 is the advance approval by a public charity that a potential grant or contribution is an unusual grant that should not affect that public charity's public support status. So then, putting those aside, there are 7 options in this 8940 form for public charity or private foundation status requests. And the instructions to the form provide a lot of specific required information for each type of reclassification. So be sure to look through the instructions before beginning to prepare the form. The first type of change is a change in type or the initial determination of type for a 509A3 organization. So as you may have noticed when I ran very quickly through the supporting organization tests, there are 3 types, type 1, type 2, and type 3, very cleverly named. Anyway, you use this particular section of the 8940 to either request the determination of the type, because many supporting organizations were created and recognized before the type categories became important. So you can either use this procedure to request a change in your type or the initial determination of type 1, 2, or 3. This requires completing the Schedule F to Form 8940. The second reclassification is reclassification of foundation status. Note that this part of the form can be really confusing because reclassification of foundation status actually can mean reclassification from or to classification as a public charity. So a user checks this box if requesting a reclassification of the status. There are instructions that supplement the procedures, and these are updated annually. For this type of request, the user also completes Schedule G. This box is checked if the organization erroneously determined that it was a private foundation, but was actually qualified and has continued to qualify as a public charity since inception. This also is the section to use if the public charity is seeking classification as a private foundation. But it's important to note that a public charity that has become a private foundation doesn't necessarily have to file Form 8940. It can indicate its new private foundation status simply by filing Form 990-PF instead of the usual Form 990 that public charities file. So back to the reclassification of foundation status, this box is also used for private foundations seeking classification as an operating foundation or an exempt operating foundation. And finally, for organizations that are non-exempt charitable trusts and want to have an initial determination that they are in fact described in Section 509A3 of the Code. So these are very technical areas, and for an organization that falls within any of those, you'll probably need the assistance of a tax-exempt organization specialist, attorney, or accountant. So the next 3 options on the Form 8940 apply to private foundations that are reclassifying as public charities. So the first of these 3 options is the termination of private foundation status under Section 507B1B, where the user is requesting an advance ruling of public charity status. You check this box if you are an organization requesting an advance ruling on termination of private foundation status, that is, to reclassify as a public charity. To do this, the organization will complete Schedule H to Form 8940. So the organization that wants an advance ruling under this section can terminate its private foundation status and get the advance ruling if it meets the requirements of public charity status under 509A1, 2, or 3. Remember, those are the sections I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode. You have to meet those public support tests for a continuous 60-month period beginning with the first day of any tax year, and the organization must have notified the IRS before the beginning of the 60-month period that it is intending to terminate its private foundation status. The private foundation following this process must also establish immediately after the end of the 60-month period that it has in fact met the public support tests. Note, if the IRS erroneously determined that an organization is a private foundation, but it actually qualified as a public charity and continues to qualify, the organization can request retroactive reclassification as a public charity instead of terminating private foundation status under this section 507B1B. In that case, follow the instructions and select the Part 2 of the 8940 test that refers to reclassification of foundation status instead of using the termination of private foundation status procedures. So then the next box to check on the 8940 is the notice-only termination of private foundation status under section 507B1B. The private foundation that's converting to public charity status checks this box if they're providing notice only of the termination of the private foundation status, but you are not looking for an advance ruling. This is merely the notice requirement, and then when the organization meets the requirements for the continuous 60-month period beginning with the first day of any tax year and has already notified the IRS, then at the end of that 60-month period, they do a follow-up 8940 filing with the actual results of that 60-month period. So there's a difference in these two boxes. One says we want an advance ruling. We think we will reasonably be expected to meet the public charity requirements. And the other one is simply saying, hey, we're going to try to meet this, but you don't need to treat us as a public charity right now. So there's strategic differences why you choose one over the other. So then finally, as I alluded to, there's a section for an 8940 checkbox for termination of the private foundation status at the end of the 60-month period. So this box is checked when you've reached the end of the 5 years, when you can in fact show that the organization has raised sufficient public support to be described in section 509A1 or 2. When this box is checked, that's when Form 8940 Schedule J applies. Then there's finally a couple of rarely used miscellaneous classification requests. A voluntary termination of 501c3 status by a government entity, and then there's a special rule for Canadian registered charities. Any Canadian charity that's registered with the Canada Revenue Agency is automatically recognized as tax-exempt under the United States-Canada Income Tax Convention. So if you are a Canadian charity and want to be listed as an organization described in 501c3 on irs.gov, or you want classification as a public charity rather than a private foundation, the Canadian charity can complete Form 8940 Schedule K. Here's the tricky part. You've figured out which box to check. You've filled out the schedule. Now, the tricky thing is the explanation of the request, the technical legal explanation of why the organization should be classified the way that the organization is requesting. It's very important to describe completely and in detail the request for the determination that you're making. The description should include the nature of the request as well as the reasons for making it. For more information on what to include, be sure to look at the 8940 instructions for the specific request in the appropriate schedules. In many cases, the organization's accountant can provide the necessary information about the sources of support for the reclassification when moving to public charity status. In other cases, the statement will require some legal analysis and an explanation of how the status is met. For example, for the technical supporting organization tests and the request for classification as type 1, 2, or 3, it may behoove the organization to run the final draft of the request by legal counsel to make sure that all the nuances of the various types of classification requests have been met. After you submit the Form 8940, it will take some time to get a response. If the IRS review shows that the organization meets all the requirements for the requested miscellaneous determination, the organization will receive a determination letter stating that the request was approved. Sometimes the reclassification appears on the IRS website before the organization gets the determination letter in the mail. So you may want to start checking the IRS website if you haven't heard anything back in 3 months or so. The updated determination letter will in fact be posted on IRS Select Check eventually. Sometimes the IRS can't make the determination without more information, and sometimes the examiner will call the representative listed on the 8940 and the accountant or attorney if a power of attorney form was filed, or sometimes the examiner sends an actual letter with a written request for additional information. The IRS has listed examples of the types of questions that may be asked in connection with all of the requests I've described in this episode, and you may want to review that list before submitting the 8940 to try to anticipate all of the information that may be needed and how the IRS may respond to your initial request. The show notes include a link to the IRS page that addresses the types of additional information that are often requested. So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to the resources mentioned today. Also, Farella Braun Martel has a YouTube channel, and the nonprofit playlists for the EO Radio Show podcast organize all the past episodes to make it easy to find information on topics relevant to you. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Ferrella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.